turn my attention to welcoming and thanking Dr. Stephen Gross, Professor and Chair of Johns Hopkins University Department of Philosophy, who is going to be giving us a glimpse into his research and a sense of what interests him and how he ended up looking at the interplay between beliefs and our perceptions. In addition to being a member of the faculty at Johns Hopkins University, Stephen has some deep ties to the history of CTY. And so, Stephen, without further ado, let me turn this over to you, and I'll let you fill in the blanks on your connection to the work. And in advance, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Can you hear me, Simeon?
I can. We're all set. Yep, perfect.
Oh, okay, good. My screen said I was muted. Okay, you can hear me now. That's what we're all getting used to with these Zoom things. So, well, Simeon, thanks so much for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be participating in this discussion with the CTY community. As was mentioned, I'm sort of a CTY alum. I'm actually an alum of the precursor of CTY, Dr. Julian Stanley's study of mathematically precocious youth, which I participated in the 70s when I was about, starting when I was about 12 years old. And it then evolved into something larger than just math. At some point the name changed, I believe, to study of intellectually precocious youth, or maybe intellectually and mathematically precocious youth. And I've one mildly, I suppose, amusing anecdote. I was on campus one time to participate in a research study. And whenever we did this, they would give us a little token thank you. In this case, it was a $2 check. And my father would not allow me to cash this check. He actually gave me the $2. So I got the money. But the check he wanted to keep for himself. And in fact, he put it up on the mirror in his bedroom, and he had it there for the remainder of his life. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen, because on the check, the word intellectually was spelt wrong. So that's my amusing anecdote. Now, since we're on a webinar, I can't hear you, so I can't hear all your uproarious laughter, but I hope you found that amusing. So I'm going to talk today about thinking and seeing. Can what you believe affect how things look? And this topic sometimes goes by the name in the business of cognitive penetration. And to explain what the question is that we'll be talking about, let me first say something about what the question is not. So I'm not asking, can what you see, how things look, can that affect what you believe? I'm not asking that, because the obvious answer to that is yes, of course. You believe there are cookies in the cookie jar. You go over and open it up and you see there are no cookies. Well, then you update your beliefs. You adjust your beliefs. You now believe there are no cookies in the cookie jar because of what you saw. So of course, what you see affects what you believe. The question that we'll be talking about goes in the opposite direction. Can what you believe affect what you see? Could there be two people, they're looking at the same thing, their visual apparatus, their eyes are identical, they work in the exact same way, but because of a difference in background belief, it actually looks different to them? That's the question we're asking. And you can kind of generalize this question. People ask, can cognitive states, by which they mean things like beliefs, but also desires, ways you want the world to be, intentions to act, can these kind of states affect or penetrate down into perception, how things look, how they sound, how they feel when you touch them, etc.? So why might one think that there might be cognitive penetration? Well, if this were a class instead of a large webinar where I can't hear you, I'd say, well, can you think of possible cases? That's how I would get the discussion going. But since I can't hear what you say back, though maybe in that Q&A thing that was mentioned before, you can throw out some things if you want. But since I can't hear you, I'm going to just tell you, here's some of the things that often people will first think of, my students will first think of when I ask them. So they'll say, well, maybe here's a case. When you learn a new language, how it sounds changes. So before you know the language, a language just sounds like an uninterrupted stream of sound. Blah, 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 blah. Once you know the language, though, it starts chunking into words, and you can hear the pauses between the words. Maybe your knowledge of the language causes it to sound different. Here's another kind of example people will sometimes give, also an auditory example. Well, music. Maybe the same piece of music will sound different to an expert and a non-expert, even though they're sitting next to each other at the same performance. Someone who knows a lot of music theory, for example, when they listen to a Bach fugue, maybe it actually sounds different to them than it does to the non-expert. Okay. Well, how about this? This is from an experiment from the 1940s that was undertaken by Jerome Bruner, an American psychologist. And the results of this experiment, plus a bunch of other ones that he and his colleagues did, convinced him that there was cognitive penetration. So I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to have to jump us out from my slides over to YouTube. But before I do, let me tell you what you're going to see. It's only 10 seconds long or so, this clip. And you're going to see a series of playing cards flashed at you, I think 5 of them, really quickly. The task that a participant in this research experiment would have would be to say what suit they saw for each of the cards. Okay, and so you can try to do that, say it out loud if you want, or just look and see what suit each card is. So here we go, let's hope this works. All right, let me make it bigger for you. Whoops. Oh, I gotta hit this. Okay, let me get us back to the slides. Now, some of you might have noticed there was something odd about one of the cards, but some of you probably didn't. The real question here is what suit was the 4th card? And when Bruner did this experiment, he found that most people, not everyone, most people said that the 4th card was hearts. But in fact, it was spades. The card looked like that. It's an odd card. It's a red 6 of spades. Of course, there is no such thing. So what Bruner concluded, again, not just based on this experiment, but others also, was that in a case like this, you have a background belief that red cards are either hearts or diamonds. And the spade shape, it's a little bit closer to the heart. So when you're trying to, when you look at this, you see it as being hearts, especially if it's presented so quickly, the way it was in that video. So your background belief about the typical colors and suits of cards and how they are associated causes you to see hearts, at least for those of you who thought it was hearts. Okay, let me give you another example, sine wave speech. I'm going to have to pop out again to YouTube. And there's some writing there in the video itself that explains what's going on. So I'll just run it and you'll see. It's only about 20 seconds or so.
The man read the newspaper at lunchtime.
Okay, so that's sine wave speech. Again, let me get us to back to the slides here. So what's going on there? Actually, no one's really quite sure. But one thought people have had is that, oh, hearing the woman present that sentence, it causes you to have a belief that there's information of that sort buried in this sine wave sound pattern, so that then you actually hear it, and it's a quite pronounced effect. You can hear the words, it seems, all of a sudden in the same sine wave sound pattern. Okay. In fact, there have been literally hundreds of studies in recent years that purport to show some sort of cognitive penetration effect. And I'm just going to give you a very quick sampling so you get a sense of like some of the range of things that have been claimed on the basis of some experimental studies. So this paper claimed that your political beliefs can cause the skin tone of political candidates to look different, right, depending on what political beliefs you have. This paper claimed that if you desire something, like you're really hungry and there's food and you really want it, your desiring something can make it look closer than it in fact is. Here's a paper that claimed that if you're playing soccer or football, if there's anyone here who's not from the US on our webinar, if you're playing soccer and you think that this other player is really good, so you have high regard for their soccer abilities, then that player will look bigger than the player would otherwise. And this last one claims that your knowledge of how certain shapes and colors are associated can make colors look different to you. So for example, if you know that things of the banana shape, bananas are typically yellow, at least when they're ripe, so you associate that banana shape with the color yellow, then when you actually see a banana, it'll look more yellow to you than it would to someone who never heard of bananas, never seen bananas, didn't associate that shape with yellow. Okay, so that's just sort of a sample. Others, however, are rather skeptical of these results, and they don't think that they show what some of these authors think that they show. And I'll be talking about that in a minute. That's why there's a question, a debate about whether there's cognitive penetration. Before talking about that, let me pause and just list a few. It's not going to be exhaustive, but a few of the reasons why you might have an interest, or why someone might take an interest in this question of cognitive penetration, why it matters. So one obvious thing is that for people like me and my colleagues who work on understanding how the mind-brain works, well, we want to know what's going on here and how it works. We want to know what are, as it were, the parts of the mind and how they interact with one another. But in addition, these cognitive penetration results can matter for people who are interested in other sorts of things too. So I gave an example before with music. You know, if you're interested in how art and our experience of art works, then you can have an interest in in cognitive penetration, also interest in art education. I quickly alluded to a racial bias example when I was reading through some of those different published papers, and I'm going to give you another example about how this research can be relevant for understanding racial bias. Obviously a matter of great social concern. There's more reasons, but I want to mention two more that have a particularly philosophical kind of cast. One has to do with how our beliefs get justified or warranted. And this other one will have to do with what makes science objective about a mind-independent world. So let me say something briefly about each. Okay, so the worry is that if there is cognitive penetration, if what we believe can affect what we see, then maybe that challenges our most basic conception of of how we justify ourselves and why our beliefs seem justified. So earlier I gave an example of looking at the cookie jar. So you come to believe there's no cookies because you see that there are no cookies. In general, our sensory experience is, perhaps the most important source of information about the world, right? That's how we think of how we justify our beliefs, by looking and seeing and hearing and smelling, etc. But what if there's cognitive penetration? That might challenge that. And so here's a case. So suppose you think Sally is angry at you. That's a belief you have, that Sally's angry at you. And you're right now looking at a picture of Sally. So here you're about to go into the classroom, say, or you and Sally perhaps are students. You're a little bit worried about this because Sally's angry at me. Oh, what's it going to be like? And there's Sally. Now I have chosen a picture that's meant to be a picture of someone with a rather neutral emotional expression. And in fact, this picture is taken from a psychological study on the perception of people's emotions. So this is meant to be a rather neutral face. But what some of these studies have found when they make claims about cognitive penetration is that if you believe that someone's angry, you're more likely to see their face as expressing anger. So there you are, you think Sally's angry, you go into the classroom, you see Sally with a face like that, and you see anger in it. And so you say to yourself, see, I knew she was angry at me. Just look at her face. What's happened here? You use the fact that her face looks angry to justify your belief that she's angry at you. But actually, the face looked angry because you already believed that she looked angry. It's what caused the face to look angry to you. So it seems like there's a circle here. So there's a threat to this seemingly obvious fact that our beliefs can be justified by our experience. Okay, the other one I mentioned was this question about what makes science objective. The worry here actually is related to the one I just presented. So suppose you have, and I'll explain this funny image in a second. But suppose you have two scientists and they have different hypotheses, different theories about some phenomenon. They'd like to know which theory is the one that's right. Well, these are one believes one theory, one believes the other theory. They hope they can find some sort of data, neutral observations that would tell in favor of one theory over the other. But what if there's cognitive penetration? If there's cognitive penetration, then it might be that depending on your background beliefs, in this case, your scientific theory, you'll make different observations. But then how can you find a neutral way of adjudicating the scientific dispute? And the image I have here is drawn from an actual incident of this sort, or at least some historians of science suggest that it's one, having to do with the development of embryos. So prior to the invention and development of the microscope, there were different views of what goes on in embryonic development. And one of them, the so-called pre-formationist view, held that you had inside the male sperm cell a small little person. It's like the little baby, but just really, really, really tiny that gets bigger and bigger and bigger throughout the pregnancy. Pre-formationist view because like the person's pre-formed. And that was one of various views. There were other views that denied this. But sperm cells are so small, there wasn't a way of gathering data to sort of choose among these competing hypotheses. Well, but then the microscope was invented. So we're talking about during the scientific revolution. And so they said, let's use the microscope and see what we see. Well, you got to remember, this is early microscopes. The acuity was only so-so. But when the pre-formationists looked through the microscope, what did they see? Well, they claimed what they saw were little people inside the sperm. So it's evidence for their view. Okay, so that's the second kind of worry. All right, so what have I done so far? I introduced this question of cognitive penetrability, whether there is any. I gave some possible examples, putative cases, and I mentioned some others. And I just said something about why it might matter, what different reasons there might be for being interested in this question. What I'm going to do now is say something about why some people think that maybe there's actually very little cognitive penetration and perhaps not any cognitive penetration at all. So I'm going to give like sort of the other side of this dispute. Though even if they're right, the phenomena remain very interesting anyway. So the first thing, here's why some people think that at best, if there is cognitive penetration, it's very limited, very restricted in its extent and its strength. Why? Well, here's the kind of consideration they give. So I take it that you all believe that egg yolks are yellow. There's a belief you have, but that, so there you go, there's a belief, but now look at this image. Hey, there's some egg yolks that are green. I realize this is a fictional case. You can imagine someone's actually presented you with an actual egg that has a green yolk. Your belief that egg yolks are yellow is not going to change how that looks to you. It's going to look green no matter what. That, the visual appearance and looking green to you resists your belief. And in fact, you might even update your belief to go, well, yolks are typically yellow, but there's some exceptions. In fact, that's how we get information about the world. There are lots and lots of cases you can easily come up with yourself where it doesn't matter what you believe, it's not going to change how things look. And one way to bring this out further is to think about perceptual illusions. I think everyone knows that sticks or rods or branches can look bent when you put them in water. And many of us in school learn about why that's so, how refraction of light works. But it doesn't matter whether you know what's going on, why it looks bent when you have it in water like that. It's enough that you know that it does look bent that way, but nonetheless, it's not bent. It's a straight rod. Your belief that it's a straight rod, however, does not change how it looks. No matter how much you concentrate on your belief, it's straight, it's straight, it's straight, it's still going to look bent to you. So again, how it looks to you is not penetrated by your belief, it resists your belief. Here's another example. It's the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Maybe some of you have seen it before. We've got two lines here, and they have these like arrowheads and reverse arrowheads on their ends. And the top line looks longer than the bottom line. But in fact, it's not the case that the top line is longer than the bottom line. Actually, in the usual example, they're in fact the exact same length. In this particular one, I might have kind of drawn it in such a way that the top line, in fact, is shorter, ever so slightly shorter than the bottom one, but it's certainly not longer than it. Okay, now you know the top one is not longer than the bottom one. It's just kind of perceptual illusion, the trick that gets played on the eye, given the details of how perceptual processing, information processing works off the retina. But now that you know that, it doesn't change how it looks. It still looks like the top line is longer than the bottom line. So again, how it looks, your perception resists the belief. It doesn't get penetrated by the belief. If cognitive penetration was a strong effect that was extensive, this belief you acquire that in fact the top one's not longer should change how it looks, but it doesn't. Okay, so these perceptual illusions underscore two things. First of all, they remind us that it's how things look is one thing, and what you then believe on the basis of it is another thing. So maybe typically seeing is believing, as we say, but not always. Sometimes you see something, but you realize that it's not actually how things are. And second, in many cases, your belief cannot change how things look. So a person who's arguing that there is cognitive penetration, their claim has to be just that, well, there's at least some cases where it happens to some extent, and they would be other cases than the ones we're looking at. Okay, so we've just seen some reason why there's a limit to how much cognitive penetration there is. Some people go further and suggest, maybe really there's no cognitive penetration at all. And so there's different strategies they have for this, and I'm going to just mention three of them. They take the various putative cases of cognitive penetration and they say, oh, actually what's going on here is rather this, or it's instead that. There might be different things to say about different cases. So here are the three things. I'm just going to state them real fast, but then I'll go through each one by one. So maybe in some of these putative cases of cognitive penetration, your belief doesn't affect what you see. It only affects what you judge, what you believe that you see, but it doesn't actually affect how things look. I'll give an example in a moment. Or at least in some cases, maybe what's happening is not that your belief affects how vision works and therefore what you see, or if it does, it only affects it because it affects where you're looking in the first place. If you look one place versus another, of course, well, then you'll see different things. And finally, for some cases, some people want to suggest that, yeah, there's something that's going on that changes how things look or sound to you, but it's not the belief that's doing the work. It's not the thing that's causing the change, but something else. Okay, so let me now make this a bit more concrete by giving an example of each one, actually two examples of the first. So go back to the playing cards. So the person raising this challenge is going to say, for those of you who did think it was hearts, did you really see hearts? Maybe, in fact, you had a visual experience of a red spade, 6 red spades, but you misreported what you saw. You came to have maybe a false belief about what you saw. How can we rule that out? Notice that this would be kind of interesting either way. If you really did see hearts, well, that's an instance of cognitive penetration. That's very interesting. If you didn't see hearts, you actually saw spades, but said you saw hearts, thought you saw hearts, that's kind of interesting too, because it's an example of how you can have a conscious visual experience. You're aware of something, and yet you don't know that that's what you're aware of. How can you both be aware of something and not aware that that's what you're aware of? So interesting phenomenon either way. Let me give another example of this kind of challenge to the cognitive penetration claim. And this is, I said I'm just going to bring up an example of racial perception, racial cognition. This is the example. So Keith Payne, a psychologist, ran a study of the following sort. So he had participants in the study come in and they saw a sequence of pictures and had to answer a question. And they saw different pictures on different trials of the experiment. The pictures presented very quickly. You'll see this 200 milliseconds and 100 milliseconds. Just flashed up really fast. On some trials, people would see a picture of a Black person On other trials, they would see a picture of a white person. And then next, they would see, again, on some trials, it would be a picture of a gun. And on other trials, it would be a picture of a tool, pliers or drill or something like that. And then there'd be this fuzzy screen. So the pictures are all gone. And while the fuzzy screen was there, they had to say, did they see a gun or did they see a tool? And what Keith Payne found was that more often when there was a picture of a Black person quickly shown first, would people, when they in fact saw a tool, say they saw a gun. Very upsetting and striking, perhaps maybe in the United States, maybe not surprising, but a striking and surprising claim, or finding, I should say. So Payne, in his original publication on this, took it to be an example of cognitive penetration. But then he thought more about it, and thinking about things like what we were just talking about with the Brunner and the red spades, he thought, well, maybe they didn't actually see a gun when in fact there was a tool there. Maybe they saw the tool, but they thought they saw a gun or reported they saw a gun. They came to have the belief there was a gun there, though they actually saw a tool. How could one try to test that? What he did was this. He ran another set of experiments, and this time, instead of making them very quickly say what they saw, he let them have like a little bit of more time, actually really just about a second. And so they could correct the first thing that came out of their mouth if they wanted to. And here's what he found. Basically, the effect went away. So first, see where it says speeded, and it's pointing up, you have false tool and false gun. The false gun columns indicate when someone saw a tool but said they had a gun. And you'll see that when it was a Black face that was first presented, people got it wrong 15% of the times. When it was a white face, they still actually got it wrong a fair number of times, but less, 11% of the time. But if they were given an extra second to, it says no time limit here, but actually people would tend to answer very, they would correct themselves pretty quickly. If they gave them just a little bit more time, the effect completely went away. If anything, by a very small amount, they made the mistake more often, slightly more often with the white face. So from this, Payne concluded, they're not actually seeing a gun in those cases. They're seeing a tool, but they jump to the conclusion that it was a gun, but then they can correct themselves because they kind of still have the image in memory. Okay. Now, you might be thinking, some of you, something along the following lines. Well, look, whether the person saw a gun or just jumped to the conclusion that there was a gun there, even though that's not what they saw, either way, that's exhibiting a kind of racial bias. And that's what matters for social purposes. Whether it was cognitive penetration or not, whether they actually saw a gun, that seems like less important. Well, indeed. I don't disagree. However, it's not irrelevant for social purposes, because getting right exactly what's going on could matter for amelioration, for making things better. So how do you deal with this racial bias? You have to understand how the racial bias is working to know what kind of things you can try to do to eradicate it. Okay. Let me turn to a second way that some people have responded to some of the putative cases of cognitive penetration. So an obvious way a belief can affect what you see is if the belief causes you to look somewhere else. So we're playing hide and seek. I think Sally's hiding to the left. You think Sally's hiding to the right. I look to the left. You look to the right, because we're looking different ways for our eyes. The direction of our eye gaze is going different ways. Obviously, we see different things. Could something like that be going on in some of the cases? So let me give you an example, a more subtle example than the example I just gave of playing hide and seek. Some of you might have seen the Necker cube or the duck rabbit before. These are both cases where a stable drawing can be seen in two different ways. And I'll just, in the interest of time, quickly say something about the duck rabbit. So with the duck rabbit, you've got these protuberances coming, out of its left side, and you can see them as the beak of a duck, or you could see them as rabbit ears with the rabbit's mouth on the right side. And so some people have thought, look, I can flip it at will from duck to rabbit to duck to rabbit. So which one I want to see can cause me to see one or the other. And that's true, you can flip them. But it turns out in order to flip them, you have to move your eyes. when your eyes are focused on different points, you can make the flip. And actually something similar is true with a Necker cube. So in these cases, at least, it seems that your belief affects what you see in via something intermediate. They mean by making your eyes move, not by changing visual processing. And that's interesting to know. Okay, the very last one, and I'll be quick here in the interest of time. Maybe in some cases, yeah, there is a change to how things look, but it's not your belief that's causing the change. Maybe it's the previous experiences you've had, the previous stimuli that affect what you see or hear. And your visual system, your auditory system is just attuning itself to what it's finding in the environment. Learning a new language, even learning your first language, could be an example of this. So there you are, a baby, a toddler. You're hearing the ambient language around you, maybe it's English, and your perceptual system could be, in fact it is, attuning itself. Your auditory system attunes itself to the kinds of speech sounds that it hears around it. It's not that the 15-month-old is forming lots of beliefs about English. English has the following sound system, and it draws these distinctions among sounds. It's not that the infant or toddler is forming these beliefs. It's just that their auditory system is itself getting tuned by the stimuli around it. And similarly, when you learn a new language, if it's a second language, that's why it starts sounding different, not because of your beliefs. So some people claim. Maybe something like that on a shorter time scale is happening with sign speech, but that's hard to know. Okay, last slide. So maybe there is cognitive penetration. Maybe there isn't. It's a subject actually of intense experimental investigation by perception scientists. And because of the various reasons that it can matter that I mentioned above, it's also a subject of intense philosophical debate among scientifically informed philosophers. So you have folks from each of these two groups who often will collaborate together in thinking about it. And that's me in the upper left, and two vision scientists here at Johns Hopkins that I collaborate with, John Flumbaum and Ches Firestone. So this is an example of one of the various fascinating spots where science and philosophy have a point of overlap and can fruitfully interact with one another. And with that, I will just say thanks very much for allowing me to bend your ear. And I look forward to chatting some more with you if you guys have some questions.
Stephen, thank you so much. We do have some questions, and it's fascinating because as I'm reading the narrative arc of the questions, a number of them were previewing some things that you touched on a little bit later in the discussion. So let me start with this one, which is how does what a psychologist see differ from what a philosopher sees?
So I guess there's two different ways of taking that question. One is that philosophers and psychologists, we're people too. We've got eyes. So is it possible that we see different things? Just like in the case with the preformationists, those scientists might see different things. And you can be asking just because we're people, or you could be asking because we're scientists or researchers with particular theories. That's one kind of question you could be asking. Another kind of question you could be asking is, how do we approach the problem of cognitive penetration? So on the first question, the first way of taking the question, I actually am among the people who are a bit skeptical that there really is such a thing as cognitive penetration. I don't think that the experimental results show cognitive penetration. I think the kind of things I was saying in the end show that there's other stuff going on. And so I don't think actually that the psychologists and I will see different things. We're both looking at the banana. We're going to see this, our visual experience be the same, assuming that there's no differences in our retina or things like that. But how do we approach these questions? Well, I'm not a trained psychologist. I'm not a vision scientist. I don't have training in statistical analysis or in careful experimental design. I know something about it. I can participate in a team that's working on something, but I leave that part to the experts. I have a different kind of expertise. I might have spent more time thinking about social concerns and racial bias, for example. So, I bring something to the collaboration. The psychologists bring a different kind of expertise to the collaboration. We learn from each other, and we are better for working with each other because the whole is more than the sum of its parts.
So there are a few questions about the gun study, and I don't know if you happen to have the answers to this, but one was how many people were in the gun study, and then as a follow-up for the sample, the people who were involved in the study, how many were Black, how many were white? Did that make a difference to the reporting?
Yeah, so I should say some of these things I don't happen to, so I don't have that on my mental fingertips, for my excuse is that actually I'm in the middle of the past few months finishing up some other project. So I don't know the exact number of people, but it was a large enough number that you could do statistical analysis. So I think it was a pretty well powered study, as scientists say. There is sometimes a worry with some of these things if you only have a few people. Actually, maybe I'll add another remark about that in a moment. But about the other question about the subjects, did you both have white subjects and Black subjects? I believe, so I'd have to go back and check it. And most of these studies, that's something, of course, they'd be very, very careful about. One of the first things they would think of, because they're always looking for possible ways the studies could go wrong and possible confounds. That's what they have expertise in, unlike me. And I believe this was a study where that was carefully balanced. And if I remember correctly, in this study, it didn't make a difference to the results. I could be wrong about this particular study. I'd want to double check. But I am very confident that you do find in other sorts of studies of racial bias that groups that are biased against have oftentimes, as a statistical average, have oftentimes imbibed also the bias of the community around them, which is another very sad thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, this question of bias is one that does seem to be a thread that's running through, and some curiosity about the studies and how as a researcher, researcher working with a team, you take into account things like the major events that are happening in the world around issues of race, and the time that you're doing the study, what's happening in a broader context, societal context, and in terms of how that might influence the outcomes of what you are studying.
Sure. So first of all, I didn't do those studies. So let's keep paying. So, but I can speak kind of in a more general sort of way. So I just want to make sure people don't think that I'm going to say like something. Here's how we did it on that particular study. Right. So I mean, one thing is that you don't just do it once. A good study is done with a lot of people at different times, and a study that's going to have legs is one that other labs are going to replicate. If they don't replicate it, then it drops out. Of course, things don't always work up in accord with the ideal, but that's how it's supposed to work and how it often works. Mm-hmm. And so if it's being done across at different times, then hopefully that would come out in the wash. But I would say it's also the case for this example of racial bias, certainly among the Black subjects of the experiment, I would think, and this is just me reporting what my own African-American friends and colleagues say to me. It's not something I'd be an expert on. But what many of them would say is that, no, maybe it's a special moment in terms of awareness of the white community, but this is a daily experience for many of them. So it's not going to change, for those subjects at least, how they perform on the task.
Okay. Well, here's an easy question for you to answer. Is it possible to prove cognitive penetration true or false?
Well, that's what scientific inquiry is about, trying to gather strong evidence for a hypothesis or against it and for counter-hypotheses. And often one can have some really strong evidence that establishes a claim. And there's no reason why that couldn't turn out to be the case with cognitive penetration. And I think actually right now the evidence is not particularly strong that you actually have an effect on perception. But there are other people who disagree. One thing I should mention that can make it more challenging to build up a consensus around a scientific hypothesis is that sometimes as you're pursuing the question, sort of conceptual questions come up about how just exactly to understand and characterize the phenomenon. And that's one of the roles a philosopher can play in just trying to sort out different interpretations. In the case of cognitive penetration, one thing that's happened the more that we've studied it is that we've drawn finer distinctions and just classified differently different sorts of phenomena that before we were running together. And let me give you an example. I was a little bit abstract how I was just putting it. The example of how attention can affect things, right? So I said, well, where you're looking, can affect how things look to you, whether your eyes are directed one way or the other. And maybe we don't want to count that as cognitive penetration. But there's very subtle forms of attention where you can shift your attention without even moving your eyes. If beliefs can have an effect on that kind of attention, should that count as cognitive penetration or not? Because it seems like beliefs can have that kind of effect. If you define cognitive penetration so that that kind of attentional effect counts, well, then there is cognitive penetration. If you define cognitive penetration so that it doesn't include that, then there's not cognitive penetration. So that's one kind of thing that a working scientist comes up upon all the time, no matter what area of inquiry. As you pursue your inquiry further, you need to sharpen your concepts and your characterizations of the phenomena themselves. But having done that, then sure, you hope that with more work and more ingenuity in crafting your experiments, you'll come up with a convincing answer in the end.
Can what you believe affect your sense of taste?
Oh, good question. So here's an example that some people have discussed, and that's wine tasting. So that'd be another area where expertise seems to have an effect on people's performance on various kinds of tasks. And there's debate here too about, if there were an effect, then you might think it's cognitive penetration. So is there an effect? Or where people find effects on experiments, can they be explained away in some of the ways I said in the end? So, well, gosh, maybe it's that people who are expert wine tasters are able to direct their attention to things that the non-wine tasters can't. And they know how to direct their attention by moving the wine, but they develop techniques for how you move the wine around on your mouth and things like that. Or, and these things aren't exclusive of one another, maybe through this concentrated training in wine tasting, they've actually changed their sensory apparatus. So it's not beliefs that have changed, but the sensory apparatus itself that has changed. Or maybe their experience is the same as the non-expert, or at least the same if the non-expert were to swish it around in the same way. But they're better able at then describing what they're experiencing. They have concepts that they can apply that the other person doesn't, so they can articulate it better. Those would be alternatives to saying that it actually tastes differently to them. And that's actually something that people have investigated. I think the wine industry has been happy to supply funding for research of that sort. And there's not a consensus. There are people who've argued on both sides of that debate. Another area is if the food industry in general is very interested in these sorts of things. And there's a person named Charles Spence at Cambridge who not only works on these sorts of things, the perception and food, but he's written some popular books about it if you're interested.
So you seem to suggest that you're skeptical that cognitive penetration exists. So what are the most compelling arguments from your perspective against its existence?
I think there's different kinds of answers in different cases. And and I'll qualify it. I'm skeptical, meaning I'm on the fence. Maybe some, maybe if there are, there's a certain kinds of, maybe it's limited. If we count in the attentional cases, okay. So I'm maybe more skeptical than some others, but it's not like I think, oh no, there's definitely none. But I think there's different things to say about different cases, and that's why I gave the three examples. The three different kinds of strategies. So there's no one that I think. I think in the case of the Bruner one. I think it's an effect on the judgment you form, not on what you see. I think the duck rabbit seems to me clear in an attentional effect. Different things in different cases.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll throw out one other thing, which is that some of these exciting results have had some problems with replication.
Okay.
So that's another thing.
Mm-hmm. So have any of the recent technological advances, such as AI, been used to explore cognitive penetration, and would you view this as a potential way to advance knowledge of cognitive penetration?
Good question. I mean, they're all good questions.
Mm-hmm.
When I say good question, because I don't really know the answer. Actually, I guess I kind of do know the answer. The answer, right? The first part is that no, I don't think there's been any work in AI specifically on cognitive penetration.
Mm-hmm.
But could it? Maybe. There's certainly a lot of interaction with vision scientists on the one hand, and people who do computer vision on the other in AI, try to learn from each other. But here's maybe one reason why that might not be a good source of information about cognitive penetration. I'll give two reasons actually. One is that when your AI systems, when they're being designed, it's an engineering project. You're trying to design something to do something well, not worrying about whether is this how humans do it. Think about a calculator. That's a bit of AI,
Mm-hmm.
and it's designed to be able to do big multiplications without making mistakes and do them really, really fast, so they can be a good tool for humans. But you wouldn't then say, well, gosh, now that I've designed this calculator, maybe you all don't even know what a calculator is. For people my age, we had pocket calculators. Now you've just got a thing on your phone. That's when calculators do a multiplication. So I've designed this calculator. And it works a certain way. It's great. Should I conclude from how it works that, and here's how the human works? No, not at all. It's designed to work completely different from how humans work, so it won't make the kind of errors humans make if they're doing a long multiplication. So you can't jump from one to the other. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that a lot of the recent advances in AI have been deep learning, deep neural nets. They work really well at pattern recognition. So they're able to do certain kinds of perceptual tasks and basic categorization. They've had very little by way of advance when it comes to the more cognitive, what I was calling the cognitive realm. Your beliefs, your desires, your intentions, mm-hmm. Pretty much nothing there. And for good reasons, and they're all aware of that. So it's not there yet for us to actually be able to use it as a tool to understand how cognition interacts with perception. So, sorry, that's my answer to that one. Okay. I realize this is recorded, it's going to be posted up there, and if anyone reads this who's in AI, they're all going to yell at me. But what can I do?
It'd be an opportunity to start to deepen the conversation, I suppose.
Yeah.
So there are a suite of questions that are all around the interplay between the research on cognitive penetration and mental health, and that would looking at the relationship between cognitive penetration and paranoia, between perception and different issues that people might be struggling with. In the work that you've been doing, have you been looking at the link between cognitive penetration and mental health in any way, shape, or form?
I haven't, and I'm not aware of anything off the top of my head that's directly related to that, but there may be something indirectly related. So a couple quick comments. One is that it is the mind, the brain, they're incredibly complicated. It is really hard to understand what's going on there. I mean, we're talking about trillions of synaptic connections, etc. Mm-hmm. And so, you try to find as a scientist, and again, I collaborate with scientists. I'm not trained as a scientist myself, trained as a mathematician, but as an inquirer or someone working in a team, you try to find a foothold where you can ask a question, where you can make some progress. You try to make sure it's an interesting question. But, some of this foundational research, you have to work with things where you can, get a grip on them. So a lot of this research has to do with things like, perception of what, of a color or of a basic shape or things like that. It's a bit easier to control that in a lab. to rule out a lot of confounds. Translating it to much more complex psychological behavior, boy, it's already so complex even to figure out what's going on with just, do you see red before you? So that's the first thing I wanted to say. It's sort of an apology. We're just not there yet. A second thing, though, is that there has been work about cognitive penetration and emotion. Actually, I alluded to one before with perception of expression of anger. People have also looked at whether someone's emotional state can have an effect on what they see, but they tend not to use things like paranoia. They might use things like anger or fear. And again, part of it is just being able to get a beat on these things. Because how would you do it in a lab? Well, let me get 100 subjects, 50 of whom suffer from paranoia, and 50 of whom don't suffer from paranoia, and see that it's kind of hard to actually do that well. But you can do things where you're going to have some subjects who are put into a state of fear and some subjects that aren't. You make them watch a scary movie, for example, and then other ones that are not, and then have them perform a task. Yeah, so there's a few things.
Okay. And in the research you've been doing, have there been any gender effects that are coming to the fore just as you're thinking about issues of cognitive penetration? There are a few questions all related to gender and perception.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work on gender differences in perception and cognition, well, more so in cognition generally. And for the most part, they've shown practically no differences whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I don't know of any specifically on cognitive penetration, but probably because the other ones haven't shown much of differences. I mean, there's a thing people debate about. So, I'm trying not to, I give answers in my classes and in real conversations that are always too long. So I'm trying to be brief, but that also means I'm going to be like saying things a little bit more firmly than in fact is the case. People debate about these things. It's an open area of research. But I think my sense of that field is that there haven't been strong differences found. And that's why it wouldn't be the first thing we'll be looking for in the cognitive, haven't found it elsewhere, why would we find it here? Mm-hmm. Of course, people think differently. People's attention might be drawn to different things. But that wouldn't be because of how their mind works. It'd be because of what they've experienced in their life. So I don't at all mean to be denying that if you've had different sorts of experiences in your life, then you might come to have different sorts of beliefs. You might focus on different things. And in a broader sense of the word see than I'm using here, you might see things differently. Mm-hmm. So I before gave examples like if you have expertise in music or things like that, your attention will be drawn to different sorts of things. If I think in the description that was sent around before this discussion, I used the example of painting. You'll know to look at various things. Well, your lived experience will affect how you perceive things in all sorts of ways. But how does it affect it? It might be that you will look at different things, or you'll infer different things from what you see. Actually, let me, if I can, filibuster, as it were, take a little bit more time. Let me add something about that, because it might be a natural question some people are thinking about. You might want to draw a distinction, many people do who work in this area, between what you actually see and what you infer from, perhaps quickly and automatically infer from what you see. So here I'll use a racial example. You can easily come up with gendered examples. You see someone walking around in a store and kind of looking at things, or maybe looking from the outside of the store. And one person, and let's suppose the person's African American, one person who sees that person doing that might take the person to be casing the joint. And the other person might not think, who doesn't have a racial bias, might not think that. Or the person who has the racial bias might not think that, see the person as casing the joint if the person is white, for example. There's a made-up example here, but let's suppose that's so. You might use the word see there. Oh, well, I saw him casing the joint. I wouldn't call that actually perception, though. I would say that's something you inferred from what you saw. And let me give a mundane example to make it a little more concrete what I mean. We say things like, oh, it looks like rain, because the clouds are dark and it's windy, so you feel the wind on you. I wouldn't say that you are seeing the future, seeing rain. You are, in fact, just drawing an inference from what you see. You see dark clouds, you associate them with rain, and you infer that. So maybe some of the things that one might think of as how, oh, because I'm a woman, I see things differently from other people, or because I belong to this other group, I see things differently. It might be that either one, there are things that your attention will be drawn to that other people won't notice, or two, things you can very readily, almost automatically infer that other people won't be able to infer. And that might be a different phenomenon than how it actually looks to you in the sense that I'm using it. Still important and fascinating phenomenon.
So Stephen, you are generating a huge number of questions. I think that this is exactly what we hoped would happen. We are coming toward the end of the hour, and I do think that a number of the questions can be wrapped up if you would just share a little bit about your path to this particular question. And you also had mentioned that you have moved on to some other projects. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how you find the question, how you came to collaborate, and maybe in that, if you can reference some of the work with the Science of Learning Institute, because I think one of the interesting pieces, a number of people were saying, is it better to go the neuroscience route, the psychology route to solve these kinds of questions? And I think that you are a great example of it's not an either or, necessarily an either or choice.
Yeah, so let's see, I'll start with the last thing. Yeah, all of the above. Some tools are better for certain questions, and it depends what parts of what kind of questions about the mind brain or one's interested in. So, if for an undergraduate, you'd want to take classes in philosophy of mind, you want to take classes in neuroscience and linguistics and psychology, and for each of these areas, there's a lot of different parts. Even just within neurosciences, there are people who study things on the cellular level. There's systems neuroscience, and we want what we learn in all these different areas eventually be able to come together in some sort of unified view about what's going on in these different phenomena. For some phenomena, we're further along in one area, and some phenomena are further along in different areas, and so part will depend on one's interest. But let's see, I'll say something of how I got here and also my other projects. I mean, I still work on cognitive penetration. I'm actually supposed to be writing something about it at the moment, but I've put it off for a month or two so I can finish up some other stuff. It's just that I tend to have multiple projects with different collaborators going on at once, and I'll say something about the Science of Learning Institute project I've been working on with Chaz Firestone. I'll do that first, and then maybe I can say something. I don't know, I have too much of interest to say, but I can say something about how I got here. So Chaz and I, he's a professor in psychological and brain sciences. He has a secondary appointment in philosophy, as I have a secondary appointment in his department. And we've been looking at some phenomena where it seems that perceptual systems behave in a way that's kind of irrational. And why is that so? Looking at the ways in which perceptual system can be tricked or act in funny ways can give us information about the kind of shortcuts and tricks of information processing that the visual system has come to use, because it's under a lot of pressure over the long course of evolutionary history to not use up too many resources. So here's just a real quick example of something kind of cool, and you can kind of even do this at home. You're gonna have to imagine it, because I could try to I could search through my computer and call up a visual image, but maybe I'll just describe it. This is called the size-weight illusion. So imagine you have two boxes that are solid, and they look exactly the same, except one is bigger than the other. But otherwise, they're the same. And then I tell you, I'm going to put these on your hands, and the question is, which one do you expect to be heavier? And it looks like they're made of the same material and all that sort of thing. And so, of course, you expect the one that's bigger to be heavier than the one that's smaller. Now, actually, it's a trick. The one that's smaller, in fact, is filled with something really heavy, and the one that's bigger actually is lighter. There's it's hard for me to do this quickly. There's a view about the nature of rationality that says you should take into account your prior expectations, and also you should take into account how things feel to you when, what your stimulation is. I'm messing it up because I stated it wrong. They actually weigh exactly the same. The small one has heavier stuff in it. but the trick is that they actually weigh exactly the same. Sorry, so weigh the same. So the question is, how will it feel to you? And you might think, well, either they'll just weigh the same to me. I'll go, huh, surprising. The smaller one and the bigger one weigh the same, though I thought the bigger one was going to weigh more. Or if they weigh different, you think that maybe the bigger one's going to feel slightly heavier because I was expecting it to weigh more. And that might be like a kind of cognitive penetration. But in fact, the opposite happens. Though they in fact weigh the same, the small one feels heavier, and it feels a lot heavier than the big one, even though they weigh the same. What's going on? So that's a project that's been funded by the Science of Learning Institute. Okay, and the other thing is how I got here. I was a philosophy and math student working in mathematical logic. I mean, as an undergraduate, I of course had to do a wide range of different things, but mathematical logic was one of the areas I concentrated in. Actually, I had taken mathematical logic courses early on through the Joy and Stanley program when I was about 13 or 14, and got me interested in it. So thank you, CTY. And I was studying that stuff, and it turned out that some of the formal tools I learned in mathematical logic turned out to have application in understanding how natural languages work. So I started collaborating with linguists and people working on language. And that got me more generally collaborating with people in the mind-brain sciences. And then since then, I've published in a whole bunch of things, and I was different areas. And one thing I was working on was perception of language. And that got me thinking about various problems about perception more generally. The question of cognitive penetration can come up with perception of language also, and I gave some examples of that. So that was kind of the, in a nutshell, the path that got me onto this particular kind of problem.
Well, Stephen, I want to honor our time commitment, and I just want to take the opportunity on behalf of Johns Hopkins University Center for Talented Youth and the hundreds of guests who have joined us to thank you. I wish we could have everybody on screen and all the applause, but judging from the number of people and the fact that they stayed through this really super interesting talk and had so many questions, many of which you were able to at least begin addressing. A deep thank you and a tremendous appreciation. It's always good to meet someone who is part of Dr. Stanley's early research. He's somebody who was still working at CTY when I first started working at CTY, and it's always good to start filling in some of those pieces.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be able to talk to other people, students, parents, whoever, alums from CTY. CTY, or in its earlier incarnation, meant a lot to me, as I just indicated. And also, it's just a lot of fun to talk about what I'm working on. I appreciate everyone hanging around, and really appreciate your questions.
Fantastic. Just a reminder to everybody that this will be posted on CTY's website. And we hope to continue this speaker series for the foreseeable future, bringing glimpses of research that's happening across the university. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Have a good afternoon.